Hello and welcome. I am so excited to be talking for the next couple of weeks about protecting your peace during the holidays. I know that for me personally, but also a lot of the clients that I work with, we just see kind of an increase in intensity around this time of year. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about how the stress of the holidays, how not prioritizing our peace, how not prioritizing healthy boundaries not only impacts our emotional health, it impacts our immune system and it impacts our hormones. And I'm going to kind of unpack a little bit more of my personal story today. Just because I feel like so many people can relate to this, and it's just something that's not talked about as often as it should be. And that really is, the season of my life that caused me to really reevaluate my boundaries and how much I was willing to give and do during the holidays, how much I was willing to allow myself to be around people that were really unhealthy. All of that, because we all have, we're dynamic people. And so we all have all of these different moving pieces, right? We have our children, we have our jobs, we have our marriages, we have our in-laws, we have our immediate family. And that presents a lot of different moving pieces, right? That will impact our emotions, our mind, our body, our spirit, etc. And so I'm going to kind of back up to my life about 11 years ago. And during that time, my dad had passed away from brain cancer. He had battled brain cancer for about 15 months and had less than 0.1% chance of survival. But still, it was a very long journey, and I was pregnant for half of that time and then gave birth, and then he passed away. And after that, my mother's mental health issues began to flare significantly. Um, Meaning that, there was a lot of exacerbation in her mental health symptoms, her inability to cope, her manipulation, control, all of those things really just got ramped up in that season after losing my dad. And so I'm not only dealing with, having walked through an extremely intense pregnancy where I was stressed out, to the max in my emotions and in my physical body for the duration of that time. My husband also lost his job about 5 weeks before I had her. So there was a lot of stress in my life that really led to this, what I would call like not only a hormonal crash, but an emotional crash. I was only 27 years old at the time, so I was still very young. And very young, certainly, to be experiencing all of these health issues. So I have my daughter, and I'm dealing with the very acute grief loss of my father. And then, all of these issues with my mom start coming up that, of course, is triggering a bunch of past stuff that has not been dealt with. But I just keep, pushing through. I'm using the coping skills that have worked for me up to this point until they no longer worked anymore. And it was like my body just gave up around September of 2011. And I started having panic attacks and anxiety, really bad mood swings before my cycle. My periods were just off the charts crazy. And it was a very, very scary, hard time because not only had I just gone through some very, very difficult years, now it was like things just seemed to be getting worse. And my hormones were a mess. My mind was a mess. I was having to deal with all of this family pressure and stressors. And I just didn't know up from down. And so I did know enough, though, to get myself in counseling and start working through some of the emotional stuff. I got myself to a doctor who really started to help me, a naturopath, really started to help me kind of put together the pieces of why I was struggling so much. But I will never forget what he said to me. And I don't know if he remembers that he said this. He spent about an hour and a half going over my physiology and what was happening in my body. And he said, Andrea, we can do all of this work in, homeopathy and getting the right supplements on board, but you have some very significant stressors and trauma that has not been dealt with. And it's manifesting in all of these ways in your body. We can see it on your brain scan even. because we had to do some brain mapping to figure out why my thyroid wasn't working properly. And that was really the catalyst for me to kind of wake up and realize that there were some big things in my life that needed to be dealt with. So, and it was very hard for me to realize that because, again, I'd kept this stuff tucked away, compartmentalized up until that time in my life. And now all of a sudden the compartment seems to have just busted wide open, and I don't fully understand why. So I get myself in therapy. I start to unpack my life. I think, for me, there was a lot of fear around unpacking that because I had never really talked about the emotional and even physical abuse at the hands of my mother. We hear a lot about fathers abusing their children. We don't hear so much about, the maternal abuse that can happen, especially in the context of having a parent who is personality disordered, whether that be narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, or somewhere in that spectrum. There was a lot of fear that I wouldn't be believed, that I would not be taken seriously. But to my surprise, the exact opposite happened. I remember one day sharing with my mother-in-law, to me it seemed like this benign kind of event, and she just kind of like pulled back and was like, "That's abuse. Like that's not normal." And that really is what catalyzed, in part, kind of affirmed like, oh man, maybe there's really some stuff here that needs to be dealt with. So I start working with a counselor. Like I said, I'm starting to deal with trauma and memories and realizing that my coping skills are no longer adequate to deal with the stress. And then I am forced into a holiday season where I'm having to be confronted not only with all of the emotions that I'm dealing with, but the people that caused the emotions. And for so many people, this time of year is that for them, where maybe you've spent the whole year working through stuff with a counselor or doing some inner healing and deliverance stuff, or working with a life coach, but now you're having to maybe face these people. You're having to have a dinner with them, and you don't even know where to start because it really does bring up all of the stuff that you're trying to work through and heal from. And for me, that was the very first year that I realized, like, for my own mental health and for the health of my body and my growing family, because I am now not just responsible for myself. I have children, or I have a child, I have a husband that need me. And so if I'm going to choose to be around these people that are harmful, unhealthy at that stage of their life, then I need to be, I need to count the cost of the consequences and what this is going to cost me if I choose to do that. And so many of us get stuck in this place where we're like, well, if I don't go, I'm going to be dealing with emotional punishment because that's what manipulation does. I'm going to have to deal with all of the guilt trips and all of the drama and all of this stuff. And so I'm just going to go and I'm just going to shove this stuff down deeper. But then you do end up paying for it. And that was the season of my life where I really began to realize that I was paying physically, emotionally, and spiritually for the actions of others, when really all I needed to do was learn how to set some simple boundaries. And when I say all that I needed to do, it was not simple. There is so much work that goes into that. There's a lot of, again, counting the cost of, if I do this, they might respond really negatively. But I just realized, like, it wasn't worth my peace to to save face and pretend that I was okay when I wasn't, pretend that I wasn't dealing with some very, very big issues in my life that were having a pretty big impact on me. So if this is the season that you're in where you're realizing, gosh, I'm having to see people that are really hard for me to see, that are triggering, that are traumatizing, that are just maybe really unhealthy to be around, then I want to give you some strategies for how to protect your peace. Now, in that season of my life, I didn't have a lot of peace to protect. The very little bit that I did have, because my body was so weak and because my emotions were just kind of in this very raw, vulnerable state, I didn't have a lot to give away, if that makes sense. I didn't have a lot of capacity to say, okay, I can go be around my mom for 3 hours. I couldn't at that time without being significantly triggered, and then that impacting my family for sometimes weeks at a time. And so my husband and I and my counselor together began to kind of work up a plan of, okay, maybe we can go to dinner for an hour and then that's it. Like, that's the max. You and your husband have a code word that you use when it's time to go. And at that time, I was not strong enough emotionally to stand up for myself with my mother. And so he had to be the front man, which meant like, okay, Andrea, it's time to go. We gotta, we have a different family event to go to or what have you. And at the same time, because one of, a super common trauma response that people have is over explaining or over justifying because they want to avoid the emotional punishment that comes when you're dealing with a narcissist or somebody with borderline personality disorder, or maybe somebody who's just highly manipulative. And that is, again, it's over explaining. Jading is what they call it. So justifying, arguing, defending, or explaining. And so what I would get stuck in is, oh, we have to go because of X, Y, and Z, as if I had to validate my need to not be there. My core need during that season was to feel safe so that I could heal. You cannot heal if you are constantly in a state of fight or flight. And so I had to learn with the work of a counselor and a life coach to say no and just let my no be no and be like, okay, well, we have to leave at this time. We'd be more than happy to come for dinner, but we're going to have to leave at this time. And anytime, in my instance, it was my mother, but for some of you, maybe it's a grandmother or an aunt or somebody else that's trying to kind of bait you with like, oh, but so-and-so will be so sad about this, or, oh, we'd hoped we could spend more time with you. And all of those are, they're valid things. But if it comes at the cost of peace, your currency of peace, you really have to begin to evaluate, if you're doing it out of obligation or if you're doing it out of love. And those are two very different motivations. Or if you're doing it out of fear, which is also not a healthy motivation. And so in those instances, I just tend to validate and be like, I know it's such a bummer. I totally understand. But we do unfortunately have other plans. And so that's what we're going to be doing. I hope that you guys all have just a wonderful time and leave it at that. And it took me probably, I want to say like 6 or 7 years before I began to realize that normal, healthy adults, normal, healthy individuals do not respond to something like that with manipulation or coercion or, oh, we're just so bummed or we're so disappointed in you or how dare you. Like, it took me a long time to unlearn that because that was what I had grown up with. That's all I'd ever seen was manipulation and control that was weaponized against me. And so on the flip side of that, I make this sound really easy. It's not. And so I just want to validate if you are in this season where you're really having to guard your peace and your sense of just like self and wholeness, and maybe you're going after some significant healing. Easy. And the truth is that you're going to need strong support systems to really help you navigate through this. And knowing that it's really to guard your own healing and your own process, right? And so the other thing here is that usually within this, there's a lot of generational patterns that you're going to be confronted with. And so giving yourself some grace for the fact that it is going to feel challenging. It is probably going to feel difficult and even triggering. And so making sure that you're working with somebody to help you process through that stuff is really, really important. Right now, I can just tell you that a lot of the clients who are in the Keys to the Emotional Freedom coaching group, those are the triggers that we're working through, is the stuff that comes up during the holidays that triggers old coping mechanisms that we're trying to get rid of. thing that I wanted to kind of talk about with this, because it's kind of like the other side of the same coin, is that simultaneously, while you are creating boundaries to protect your peace, or maybe